Right, hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and just a quick little updated announcement here. So, when I was doing my show here on the historical perspective of miracles, how we can identify miracles when we're rational in believing in miracles based on what David Hume and Richard Swinburne said. I decided, you know what, I'm not going to just keep it as a historical survey. I'm going to give my own assessment as well. So, um, that's going to take a little bit more work on my end and it's going to be a little bit longer. And so I've decided to do it into two parts. So the first part that I'm posting here is going to cover the necessary background knowledge to understand my assessment. And so basically, I just outline historically and kind of survey what David Hume said in his paper, what Richard Swinburne's response is to David Hume about miracles. Um, as well, I have a segment in general on what the epistemology of testimony is. This is a specific field in philosophy when we're rational in believing testimony versus not, and how we can use testimonial evidence to believe in something. And that's just in general, providing background knowledge. Then, in the second part, which will be posted next week or at a later time, I'm going to get into my specific assessment of David Hume's argument against the reliability of testimonial evidence and the ability to identify and believe rationally in miracle claims and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing, splitting it up into two parts. The first part is just giving you guys the background knowledge of what Hume and Swinburne said, as well as just giving you a kind of an overview of the field in philosophy known as the Epistemology of Testimony, which is a new field that just came about really in the early 90s. 1992 is when this became sort of, and 1994 later on is when it really took off. Before that, we just had what was called traditional epistemology, where people looked at traditional sources of evidence, inferring reason, inference and reason, perceptions, memory, stuff like that. But there is seen that testimony can actually provide is a very valuable independent source of evidence under the evidentialism scheme. So yeah, I just want to share some general background knowledge about that field. And then that'll be it. That'll be the background knowledge part one show. Then in part two, I'm going to get into Dale Glover, my assessment of David Hume's miracles, and apply that background knowledge to kind of refute David Hume's take on, well, are we allowed to believe in miracles rationally? What about based on testimonial evidence of miracle claims? Okay, so with that, let's get into the show. All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today I'm continuing on, I think because my guests have also delayed until later in the month of October or early November, I'm going to continue on with doing some quick solo shows. Shows that don't require too much effort and that sort of thing. Things that I've already got. For example, I'm looking in my old philosophy of religion class when I TA'd for class Cray. He's got lots of great material. So last week I did a show on two historical cosmological arguments for God, one from Thomas Aquinas, the other from Samuel Clarke, and then I did the famous design or the watchmaker argument from William Paley, and I went over that. And that's an argument that still has merit today. Even Dr. William Lane Craig has done a show, and I'll include the link in the blog, where William Lane Craig admits that William Paley's version of the argument still works. So with that said, in this show, I want to focus on miracles, and in particular, in the first place, looking at doing a historical survey. So again, relying on Class Cray's brilliant, great work as a prof of the philosophy of religion class, looking at David Hume, what he had to say, and I'll be linking to his paper, as well as a response by Richard Swinburne, famous Christian philosopher from Oxford University. He kind of responds directly to David Hume's criteria for miracles and his critique on our ability to rely on the evidence from testimony to identify miracles and say, yeah, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Now, this show isn't going to be exactly as before. It's not just going to be a historical survey or survey of these two philosophers. At the end of my survey of what these guys say, I'm going to throw in my own work. So there is going to be a little bit of extra work here on my part. I want to throw in what modern philosophers say about not only identifying miracles, how they respond to David Hume. So I'll be looking at people like William Lane Craig, Craig Keener, Gary Habermas, Mike Licona. These guys have all done, Tony Costa, they've all done great work refuting David Hume. I mean, in philosophical circles, it's known as Hume's abject failure. And this isn't just among Christian philosophers or religious philosophers. Most people see that David Hume is complete rubbish and he's been refuted on this front. So I want to get into a little bit of that in terms of the modern scholarship and the reasons for that. But in addition, something kind of new that hasn't been, or will be unique, at least on Real Seekers, and hasn't really been addressed elsewhere on YouTube or on the internet, the modern philosophy of testimony. And I want to look at, well, how do we determine when testimonial evidence is reliable versus not, or valid versus not, and conveys knowledge as a warranted or justified true belief on people, versus when it doesn't? What do modern philosophers, having nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with identifying miracles, what do they say? So, people like Jennifer Lackey or John Greco, I'm going to be consulting their work, letting you know, there's different positions. For example, there is just the testimonial skeptics. There's three basic positions that we'll be evaluating. The testimonial skeptics, these are people, as we find out, they just, the testimonial evidence is guilty until proven innocent. You just can't take it or use it at all. And then in the middle position are what are called the reductionist position on testimonial evidence. So fitting in with what we're doing today, what I'm going to be doing today in the historical survey, David Hume fit into the middle or the reductionist category, where it says you can rely on testimonial evidences, but you have to prove it first. It has to be proven to be generally reliable or reliable testimony. And then there's the third position, which is the anti-reductionist or non-reductionist position on testimonial evidence. And they're kind of saying, look, testimonial evidence is innocent until proven guilty. It's generally reliable in general. There's a principle of testimony. So this is where Richard Swinburne would fit in, as well as Jennifer Lackey, for example. And they say, look, we generally believe testimony until it's proven guilty, until we have a defeater, an undefeated defeater for that testimonial evidence. So I want to get into that at the end and do kind of a modern day Dale Glover assessment of testimony in general, and then how we apply our evaluation of testimonial versus direct experiential evidences in assessing miracles in particular. And then I'll briefly cite my own approach, because I disagree with Richard Swinburne and David Hume's definition of miracle and what we're looking at. But yeah, first things first, let me just do my historical survey aspect and tell you what it is that David Hume and David Hume taught. Then I'll say, well, how did Richard Swinburne respond? Because he responded quite directly to Hume and assumed the same assumptions that Hume has. And then I'll get into my assessment. So let's start off with David Hume here. Let me just share my screen. Okay. All right, beautiful. Okay, so the first thing to do in terms of David Hume, how does David Hume define a miracle? What the heck is this thing called a miracle? Well, according to Hume, there are two conditions or two criteria for identifying that. Number one, it has to be an event that is not due to any natural force, process, or cause. But that's not enough. Secondly, it also has to be positively shown to be due to a supernatural cause. And David Hume obviously has God. He's the only supernatural agent that he has in mind in his essay here. And David Hume, just so you know who he was infamous or famous, depending on your perspective, Scottish philosopher living in the 18th century during the Radical Enlightenment period. Hardcore atheist, though he was too chicken to admit it, because he was living in a time where you could get killed or persecuted, and in fact he did kind of suffer some repercussions. He was denied some employment opportunities, let's say, because people realized, hey, you're a godless atheist scumbag, we don't want you here. I'll just say he's obviously an atheist. He hates religions, he hates that stuff. That's who David Hume is, and this is what he said about miracles. Okay, so obviously at this point, given this definition, I would say, is this true? Is this the correct definition for what a miracle is? And on the face of it, you could go, yeah, of course, makes sense to me. God's supernatural, so his acts are, when he does a sign or a miracle in the Bible or something like that, as a Christian theist, I believe they're supernatural. And that would follow from that the fact that there is no natural explanation or cause or mechanism that could explain these. Now, believe it or not, so Richard Swinburne, in his critique, I want to start with him because he actually adopts this David Hume's definition of miracle, and he says, yeah, this is what it is. No, I think that this is a problem of the Enlightenment. This definition here, I would reject it, as I do think some philosophers of miracles would reject this today. It's too simplistic, and you get into these endless debates about, well, this natural versus supernatural divide. You get, fundy-laced skeptics and atheists like Darren Lute from the SNS boards who foolishly and mindlessly say, but you haven't demonstrated the supernatural to be a thing yet. So what is the supernatural? I just have no notion of what that is. And they think they're smart with this stupid objection. But nonetheless, I just avoid all of that altogether because I go for a different approach. And I say that a miracle of God, or a miracle, is an event whereby we can detect its intelligent design by an intelligent agent, namely God. So that's a divine intelligent agent. That's all we need to prove. And I'm going to get into more detail on that when we get into the assessment. I've done a previous show and wrote a 21-page blog applying Bill Dembski's specified complexity criteria for inferring intelligent design of a given event. So more on that in time. But for our purposes here is, look, Hume has his definition of miracle, and it has to fulfill these two conditions. It has to be proven to be a supernatural cause through God, and it's not due to any natural process or cause or mechanism or force. Now, obviously, others have said, well, are these conditions sufficient? And in addition to people who have a different approach than me, like intelligent design, others have said, well, no, there are other conditions that are necessary. Number one, it has to serve as a sign to people, right? It has to be something surprising, extraordinary. It's an astounding event. And I adopt some phraseology here. Like I call, when I'm identifying a G belief authenticating event or a religious authenticating event, my criterion B of that is that the event has to be extraordinary. It has to serve as a sign to the people back in Israel day, back in Jesus' day, all the way up to today, or whatever time they occur. And then secondly, it serves some important or beneficial religious purpose. So this might correspond to the specification, for example, perhaps, in the intelligent design specified complexity criteria of Bill Dembski. However, we're just doing a historical survey. So for David Hume, look, he says, no, criterion C and D, you don't need any of this nonsense. A and B are both necessary and sufficient. That's all you need to prove a miracle. And in his paper, he gives the feather example, a levitating feather. And he says, look, if you've got these two conditions fulfilled with this example, that's all you need. This other stuff is fluff. So that's Hume there. Okay, so yep, Hume just basically sets aside any and all criteria, says that these are necessary and sufficient. He also rejects, differing definitions, like a layperson's definition of miracle, whereby they
people like C.S. Lewis or Gary Habermas identify different types of miracles, right? So sometimes in English we'll say, oh, that birth was miraculous. That's the miracle of childbirth. Or, oh, this fireman saved me from the fire. It was a miracle and stuff. Well, this is rubbish, right? These are not truly miracles in the truest sense of the word. According to David Hume, anyways. Look, these are not real miracles. Set this aside. You're just talking rubbish, and you're manipulating language. These aren't really miracles. These are just natural events. There's nothing special about it. Maybe it's special for you because you were saved from the fire, or it's your child or something, but it's not really a miracle. Okay, so that covers that. So Hume comes in with an example in his paper, the lead example. And he says, again, kind of like with the feather example, suppose we have this piece of lead and we see it suspended in midair. It's floating. Well, what could we conclude about this? Obviously, we know that there's the law of gravity. We know from experience that pieces of lead, you let go of it, they aren't suspended in midair, they fall to the ground because gravity pulls them down. So what might we conclude if we just see this piece of lead suspended in midair? Well, the first thing that you could do, that a lot of fundamental atheists and skeptics would probably do, is say, well, no, there's got to be some natural force that is keeping this lead in the air. It's a magic trick, or it's some kind of fraud or something like that. So there's some kind of force or natural mechanism that is opposing the effect of gravity. And that's why it's suspended in the air. Is there a string there? Are you using magnets or something? Who knows what atheists and skeptics might cook up to try and explain this. Now, if that fails, the atheist and skeptic isn't done. He has another little trick up his sleeve. And he'll say, well, the law of gravity, as it is currently understood, it's false. That's why the lead is suspended in the air. Oh, thank goodness I don't have to consider miracles of God. I'm safe. Oh, thank you. But anyways, skeptical bias aside, this is a second option, right? You would question, well, maybe the law of gravity is false. It needs revision because there's some other natural force that explains the floating of the lead in the air. There's an exception clause to the law of gravity. Obviously seeing the lead floating in the air provides us with a counterexample to this established law of gravity, or this established law of nature, and we would revise it. And scientists have and do this all the time. For example, with quantum physics, we understand that Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity has limitations, right? Once you get down to the subatomic level, it no longer applies. It's inapplicable. So you can have supposed violations of this law of nature at the subatomic realm, in the quantum realm. And yeah, you would just say, well, this law doesn't apply. It needs revision. The general theory of relativity doesn't apply on all scales. It only applies at the macro scales or atomic scales. It doesn't apply at subatomic scales. So that's the other event, right? And then the third type of conclusion you can draw is no natural force is able to explain this event. And by implication, this might show that, hey, perhaps it's supernatural. So it's important to say here, with these three conclusions, this only really satisfies David Hume's first condition, that no natural force, mechanism, or cause can explain the event. There is this, remembering Darren Lute from SNS, you haven't demonstrated the supernatural as a thing. Oh, brother, that guy. Anyways, but yeah, so it's important to note that there is this additional step of proving, and it is supernaturally caused. So that's the second part of Hume's definition. With these three conclusions, if you get down to C, you've only established the first part, or the first condition that Hume gives for his definitions of miracles. Okay, so now the question arises, okay, great. Well, how can we ever be sure that no natural force can explain this event, that this first condition for Hume's definition of miracle has indeed been fulfilled, because we've learned through science over history that, a lot of times humans make an argument from ignorance and they say, I can't explain lightning, therefore Zeus, therefore Thor. Now we've explained it. And then we find out about electricity in the late 19th century and how electromagnetism works and all this. And we understand what lightning and thunder is, and it's fully natural. It's not Thor, it's not Zeus. Oops, you theists or pagans were fools. Well, the same applies today. Maybe we don't have a naturalistic explanation for the lead floating in the air, but not so fast, Mr. Theist. Don't assume it's a miracle of God and supernaturally caused. Maybe there's a natural mechanism we don't know about. So that's what the atheists and skeptics would say here. Okay, so in order to understand how Hume goes about this, how we can ever be sure that no natural force can explain the event, you have to understand there's a fundamental distinction between testimony concerning miracles and direct experience of miracles, right? So these are two forms of evidence one can get for their belief, to warrant or justify their belief in miracles. And Hume's argument is only regarding number one. He doesn't talk about the direct experience of miracles. Sure, you're rational or warranted. If you have a direct experience of miracles, go ahead and believe it. Or to be accurate to Hume, he's just agnostic. He doesn't write about it. He doesn't address that issue. What he is writing about specifically is that testimonial evidence concerning miracles is not good enough. It's insufficient. And just a note here that class brings up, look, it's almost the fact that testimonial evidence should always be disbelieved. Now, I think that David Hume, he was so biased and atheistic and skeptical and godless that I think we can know that, yeah, he definitely dismisses all testimonial evidence foolishly, just mindlessly, and says it should be thrown out, all of it. But in his writings, probably because, again, I'm writing in 18th century Scotland. I don't want to get persecuted in that. So I'll give them an exception case. And he does write about a possible exception whereby testimonial evidence for a miracle should be believed, according to David Hume. But I think if we're reading between the lines, we know that Hume doesn't really believe this. He's lying with this example. And if you gave it to him, he would, in real life, dismiss it and say, no, like no testimonial evidence is good enough to prove a miracle. That's Hume's real position, probably. Okay, so what does David Hume say on testimony? Well, in the first place, when do we rely on testimony? And he gives certain general conditions. So number one, there's the power of memory, right? So our memories are generally reliable faculties that produce warranted or justified true beliefs all the time. I remember what I ate for breakfast today. I'm remembering what class taught when he was doing these slides in class. And I'm trying to relay some of what he said and also personalize it in terms of my own take on it and stuff like that. But yeah, I'm relying on memory. I'm justified. My memory provides me with testimonial evidence. Or perhaps some people would say memory is a perception. I think I would go that route, stuff like that. But nonetheless, our memories are accurate faculties, and we can rely on them to provide reliable testimony to others, and others can rely on their memories to provide reliable testimonial evidence for us, and they can transfer their knowledge to us in that way, and vice versa. Secondly, Hume would say, well, there's this general tendency of human beings to tell the truth when relaying testimony. If you count up the number of times we provide testimony and it's true versus the number of times we provide false testimony, it's vastly more likely that we're providing reliable, truthful testimony. Think about it. I provided testimony. I can testify to what I ate for breakfast this morning. I can testify that I like Kraft dinner or pizza or something. And I can also testify that, I fell asleep last night. Um, you know, generally, vastly, we provide testimony all the time, and people just believe us. I testify my name is Dale. You guys believe me. You believe my testimony. That testimonial evidence is great because it's generally reliable. Most of the time, people don't lie when they're testifying. It's only in extraordinary circumstances where people provide false testimony. So that's what philosophers like Richard Swinburne, as we'll see, rely on a principle of testimony. And even Asher Lancaster Thomas in The Evil God Challenge, she relies on the principle of testimony, kind of copying Richard Swinburne, to try and say we should believe in an evil God. So she kind of uses it against good God theists. I'm skeptical of this principle of testimony myself, but I would say that it is generally true. It's vastly more probable that if you're just picking at a random testimony to evaluate a priori, it's more probably true than false, just based on the numbers and you randomly picking out a testimony to say, is it probably true or false testimony, and can you rely on it and form a warranted true belief on its basis? Yeah, the numbers favor truthful testimony. And then finally, there's this reason why people wouldn't lie. There's this social cost, right? I mean, people get embarrassed when they lie. When I'm caught in a lie, I look quite foolish. I look stupid. And especially for me as a Christian, I have added motivation because I'm commanded not to lie. And as an apologist or teacher, if I get caught out in a lie, there's that added social cost. But yeah, what Hume is saying here is just human beings in general have this. They get embarrassed when they get caught lying or something like that. Okay, well, those are reasons to favor, in general, favor testimony. What about reasons for why we doubt it, according to David Hume? Well, in the first place, he gives about 4 reasons. So in the first place, we would disbelieve testimony in the presence of contrary testimony or contrary reliable testimony that's equally reliable and or more so. Then we would disbelieve something, right? So that's a reason we would doubt testimony that I'm getting. If my friend Jim Bob Jones tells me that the sky is blue, that the sky is red, but my other friend Bubba John, sorry, this is an old SNS joke with these redneck names, but yeah, so he tells me that the sky is blue, and they're both equally reliable. I've never seen the sky myself before, so I have no direct experience of it. Well, because Bubba is telling me the sky's blue and he's equally reliable, I have reason to disbelieve or to doubt, at the very least, the belief, the testimony of Jim Bob that the sky is red. Okay, another thing is, okay, well, if we have facts about the character or number of witnesses, so in Christianity with the resurrection case, right, we try to establish and head this off. We say, well, no, the character of the apostles and testifiers was reliable. They were willing to die, and or some Christians say that were martyred for their faith. That's what that argument is about there, right? And also the number of witnesses, multiple independent attestation. So this just says the number. So if we have multiple witnesses testifying that an alien spaceship showed up in the sky, we tend to believe that than if there's just one person telling us it. Finally, the manner of giving the testimony. Is some guy being shifty-eyed, or what's his body language like? The manner in which we present the testimony can impact whether we doubt it or not. And then finally, other factors, I'll get into that into the evaluation phase when we get into our epistemology papers. But David Hume just mentions, yeah, there's some other factors. But most importantly, for David Hume, he says the number one reason we would disbelieve testimonial evidence is when the testimony contradicts our experiential evidence. Experiential evidence comes to us directly, and there are various sources of evidence. Again, I'm going to be talking about this in my assessment later on when I talk about Robert Oddie, who's a world famous philosopher. I did a presentation by him, and I'll include that in the blog for you guys. But he provides various sources of direct experiential evidence. So, for example, from our memory, it's a perception. From our perceptions themselves, I see, my five senses, I see, I touch, I taste, stuff of this nature tends to be very strong evidence for us. And if that contradicts the testimonial evidence we're receiving, according to Hume, that's a reason to doubt and or disbelieve the testimonial evidence altogether. Okay, so obviously David Hume adopts evidentialism. I adopt that myself, but I'll be talking about different views in terms of epistemology, perhaps on a future solo show where I do a general epistemology show. So there are various positions. There's evidentialism, where you follow what Richard Feldman calls the principle of proportional belief, right? You proportion your level of credence, belief or disbelief, so I'm 90% convinced that the sky is blue, for example. That's got to be proportional to the evidence that I have. Obviously 90% is too low, but you get what I'm saying. Or the evidence is so powerful for the Holocaust, historically speaking, that I am 99.9999% convinced that I should disbelieve the hypothesis that the Holocaust was a conspiracy or something like that. I proportion my disbelief and or belief to fit the evidence. It's got to be a vertical line. If you have a line of evidence and your line of credence or disbelief level of credence, it's got to be a vertical line. It can't be diagonal and stuff like that. More on that in a future show, perhaps. Yep, and Hume is famous for his line that I cite all the time: the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. I agree fully with that. I am an evidentialist, and unapologetically so. Okay, so with that said, let's get into Hume's argument. And Hume's argument comes in two stages. So the first stage is premise one. The experiential evidence for the laws of nature is much, much more stronger than almost, again, remember he has his exception case there, but being true or charitable to Hume, I think if he lived today, he would say, look, the experiential evidence for the laws of nature is much stronger than any possible testimonial evidence in favor of miracles could ever be. It just automatically overwhelms any testimonial evidence. Premise two, we should proportion our belief to the evidence, evidentialism. Therefore, conclusion, the evidence strongly suggests disbelieving any testimony concerning miracles that there could possibly ever be. So this is an a priori or in principle type argument that says, look, in my experience, dead bodies never raise. Supernatural miracles never happen. So it doesn't matter. You can give me all the testimonial evidence in the world. I don't believe it. My experience outweighs the testimonial evidence. So that's the first sub-argument in Hume's overall argument here. And this is, you'll hear people like William Lane Craig, they will call this, or Keener and that, they'll call this his in principle objection or argument or sub-argument against the testimony of miracles. But Hume's not done. So if you want his kind of, why I say almost, if you want his hypothetical example that I don't think he truly believes, look at page 306 in Hume's paper. Again, that'll be posted on my blog on realseekerministries.wordpress.com. But yeah, then he moves on to stage two, right? So premise four would be, yeah, but in reality, it's not even the case that in principle, experiential evidence overwhelms any and all testimonial evidence. What's more, the testimonial evidence that we have in reality is garbage. It sucks. It is worthless. It isn't strong in any sense of the word. It's very weak, if not a total failure. And he gives about 4 reasons on page 302 to 304 as to why he thinks this. So let me bring that up here. Hang on one second. I'll just pause the recording. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up from where I left off here. Let me share the screen. Okay. So Hume, we kind of looked at before that Hume has, in principle, a reason for saying that the experiential evidence that you have, that basically the laws of nature apply, cannot be violated. Whatever miracle you're looking at, he looks at the resurrection of Jesus, for example. So look, dead bodies don't rise in my experience. So that violates the laws of nature that are well established experientially. That overwhelms your any and all testimonial evidence that you want to give that there was a resurrection or there was this miracle or something like that. But then he turns to, in practice or in reality, the actual evidence or testimonial evidence we have is of very poor quality. It's not even good testimonial evidence itself. And he gives 4 reasons for this, right? Obviously, he's talking about, well, look, scripture, biblical scripture for the resurrection of Jesus, or the Quran for Islamic miracles, or really the Hadith is where they talk about Muhammad's miracles and stuff. That's very poor testimonial evidence. I mean, in addition to just sucking in general, based on oral testimony. So we have cultures today, people all around the world are giving testimonies to miracles and stuff like that. Look at India and stuff. That testimonial evidence is garbage. But then it's even worse and even more further compounded for Christians or Muslims when you're relying on scripture, thousands of years old. You're relying on testimony of testimony or something like that, like writing down of oral eyewitness testimony. And there's been translation issues. So there's even further complications. Hume just says your evidence is garbage. And he gives kind of in general 4 things as to why he thinks the actual testimonial evidence we have, both in its written form in the Bible or whatever, or Quran, and or even in its more modern oral form in cultures that promote these things, it's all garbage. So number 1, look, the actual witnesses, let me bring his paper up here, 302. So look, number 1, the actual witnesses suck. Look, you can never have a sufficient number of men of unquestioned good sense, good character. They're the legal definition of a reasonable person, average intelligence, average wisdom and discernment, stuff like that, average knowledge, education and learning, in order to secure against the possibility that they're all just deluded or they're hallucinating or something like that. They have to be of undoubted integrity. You're never going to get the number of people needed that's going to be sufficient to overwhelm our experiential evidence and to say, yeah, this is good testimonial evidence. This is according to Hume. Obviously, apologists have overwhelmed this, right? We've got multiple independent testimony from various witnesses of Jesus' resurrection who were willing to die for their beliefs in Jesus' resurrection, stuff like that. So that's how you kind of counter it. Nonetheless, I'm not doing that. So just sticking to this, is what David Hume says, that you can never have good enough number and or sufficiently good witnesses or testifiers. The second problem that he sees here is there's this principle reason whereby human beings have remember I mentioned motivating factors not to lie, because if you get caught in a lie, oops, that's embarrassing. But on the other hand, there's also motivating psychological factors for human beings to lie, because in the hopes, hey, I'm not going to get caught. I'm a good liar. And people love a good tale. People are passionate, emotional. They want a good action adventure story. They want to believe in cool stories about far off lands and mythical beasts and radically different and weird people and stuff like that. And throughout history, we have exaggerations and stories about mythical beasts and stuff like that, like the Hydra or something, or Hercules. People want to lie, and they hope they won't get caught. Yes, there's that potential social cost, but the social benefits just outweigh it. The odds are I'm not going to get caught. This guy's not going to be able to travel to Timbuktu to check whether I'm telling the truth or not. So yeah, the people are 10 feet tall, and oh, they've got pigs that fly, and oh, it was amazing. Yeah, we've got motivating factors to lie, especially when it comes to miracles. It makes for a good story, a story that human beings are psychologically predisposed to respond to and to believe and to want to believe. Then his third point here, scrolling down to page 303, his third point, so this is where David Hume exposes himself as a racist pig, as a product of his time. And he just says, well, look, it's funny, all these miracles, they're only in ignorant and barbarous peeps. So in the Bible, you've got those ancient Jews, they were all ignorant, barbarous morons. They would just believe anything. And even today in Hume's time, where is it these miracle stories proliferate? Not in civilized white England, like with civilized people like me, a godless atheist here, with no moral standards whatsoever. But anyways, he would say, yeah, there are no miracle stories among us English. We're civilized, we're developed, we're beyond that barbarous, ignorant thinking. It's only the primitive superstitious, like the people of Africa or India or these non-civilized nations. That's where these miracle stories abound. It should be rejected for that reason. The testimony comes from people that are just savages and ignorant. Now, obviously, again, Hume was a product of his time. Number one, this has been challenged, and I shouldn't get into it, but just a quick little response is obviously this has been challenged. It's very racist and ignorant of Hume to assume that people in these developing nations or something like that are in fact ignorant and barbarous. No, they're quite civilized, and that's been proven historically and archaeologically by people. Now, there are differences in terms of the culture, and that perhaps speaks to the need for God to do more miracles in one area over another. People like biblical scholars like Dr. Craig Keener have thoroughly outlined that. But the second thing against this is Hume is just a mindless moron, ignorant of the fact that miracles do and are indeed testified to in England, in Scotland, in these so-called knowledgeable and civilized nations that he's talking about, and they happen all the time, including in Hume's day. Hume is lying, or he's willfully ignorant of the fact that even in the British Empire, miracle claims were happening all the time. So that's sort of a comeback. That's sort of an assessment. Again, I shouldn't do that. I just Hume, I got to go after him, But anyways, we're sticking to what Hume said. So this is what Hume thought. Look, only ignorant and barbarous nations and peoples, they're superstitious and primitive. Only these guys testify to miracles. Civilized people like me and my friends, we don't. We never witness these miracles. That's a reason to doubt. And that makes the testimony poor in Hume's mind. Then finally, we have the fourth and final reason, which is basically contrary religious miracle claims. These all cancel each other out for Hume, and he says, basically, you're a fool if you believe it, because these things cancel each other out. They all from the same poisonous well, throw it all out, like you would in a court of law. It's fruit from the same poisonous tree. They're mutually exclusive, so they can't both be true. Again, a false assumption, but anyways, these miracles taking place within contradictory religious traditions, for Hume, means they can't both be true, therefore they cancel each other out. Some, we know for a fact, some have to be lies, and we just can't tell, so throw it all out. It's all the same crap, the same garbage. So that's Hume's take on the actual testimonial evidence that we have in reality. So with that, he gives his final conclusion. Therefore, look, the experiential evidence is hyper strongly in favor of disbelieving the actual testimonial evidence for miracles in favor of believing our experiential evidence that the laws of nature are inviolable. You cannot violate them. So that's Hume's argument in those two stages in a nutshell there. That covers it in terms of Hume. I'm just going to take a quick break and getting into our assessment then. The first thing I want to do before I get into new stuff, I want to look at Richard Swinburne's take. So this is again following on with Class Craze lesson. Richard Swinburne is a Christian theist and he's written on miracles. The good news for Richard Swinburne is that he directly responds to David Hume's argument. So that's why we're starting with him. So in the first place, he accepts Hume's definition of miracles, those two conditions for something to be a miracle. Remember, it must be, number one, not due to any natural process, force, cause, or mechanism. And number two, is due to a supernatural cause, namely God. So Richard Swinburne simply says, yep, I'm going to presuppose that's right. That's the right definition. I agree with you. He agrees with Hume as to this definition, whereas I and many other philosophers don't. We would question this. But let's start with Swinburne's critique. So yeah, as I said, basically Swinburne, he wants to argue or show that it could still be reasonable to believe that conditions A and B have been fulfilled on the basis of testimonial evidence, despite these the quality of the actual evidence. So that's stage two of Hume's argument, or based on that experiential, that in principle argument against testimonial evidence in favor of experiential evidence. Now, Swinburne, he just totally leaves aside the second stage of the argument. He doesn't address this in the paper that I'm going to be going over with you today. All he does is attack stage one of the argument. So that's the in principle argument that he goes after. Obviously, Swinburne has written books on the resurrection. I'll be posting that on the blog for you guys as well, a summarized version of it, whereby he tackles the critique that Hume gives about the quality of the actual evidence and says, no, these four things, garbage, you're a fool. And I'm going to be providing a critique of that from people like William Lane Craig, Swinburne, and Craig Keener in his great 2-volume book on miracles. Gary Habermas has written against David Hume on this front. This is just, you're destroyed, skeptic, as we're going to see, kind of thing. But Swinburne doesn't address that in the paper I'm talking about here. He just simply goes, oh, okay, that's went too far. Okay. My goodness. Okay, here we go. So this is the argument that Richard Swinburne is responding to, this in principle argument. And he's going to say, no, the experiential evidence from the laws of nature is not necessarily stronger than any and all possible testimonial evidence. He thinks that there's a specific type of testimonial evidence that can outweigh the experiential evidence for the inviolable nature, supposed inviolable nature of the laws of nature and physics that we know. So let me get to that. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a second and just bring Richard Swinburne's stuff up. So just hang on 1 second and I'll come back to this. Okay, so picking up from where we left off with, all right, hang on. All right. Okay, so picking up from where we left off with Richard Swinburne here. So let me just share the screen again. Okay. There we go. Bring up the PowerPoint slides. Okay, so in terms of Swinburne responding to stage one of David Hume's argument, it's important to understand the difference between a repeatable counter-instance event and a non-repeatable counter-instance event. So by repeatable, it just says, well, look, there's some event that is contrary to what the laws of nature predict. but we have good reason to suspect that E would occur again in similar circumstances. So it's repeatable. Given these specific set of circumstances, it would happen again. If we have reason to think that, then we say, well, it's not a miracle. It's, remember, conclusion A, B, and C. A is, oh, well, there's some kind of natural mechanism that's opposing gravity, right? There's a string or magnets or something, or it's a magic trick. But if it does violate or is contrary to the laws of nature, the laws of nature that we know, there's also B. Maybe the laws of nature need revision. They're false in some way. And Richard Swinburne is saying, well, if it's a repeatable counter instance, then we know that, yeah, the laws of nature need revision. We shouldn't say that it's a miracle. But if we have a non-repeatable counter instance, so we have no good reason to think that that event would occur even in similar circumstances, and again, we're unable to come up with a new law of nature, a revised law of nature, to account for those E-like events, and they wouldn't occur again, now you can say it's a miracle. So that's a fundamental distinction, right? So if we have testimony, according to Richard Swinburne, of a non-repeatable counter instance, now you can conclude miracle. Okay, so what are Richard Swinburne's 5 conditions for reasonably believing testimony that an event violates the law of nature? Sorry, reasonably believing that a given event, like a levitating lead thing or a resurrection of Jesus from the dead, that this actually violates a law of nature. So 1, there's good evidence in favor of the law of nature. So this is a well-established law of nature, like the law of gravity. Yep, check. The law of nature predicts that the given event, like Jesus' resurrection, would not occur. Yep, check. It's the law of biogenesis, for crying out loud. And then thirdly, the event does in fact occur, provably occurs, and it's a non-repeatable event. So with this third criterion here, it's important. Swinburne says that testimony could, in principle, establish this. Then we have the fourthly, no plausible modification or revision to the law of nature satisfactorily explains the event. Okay. Finally, fifthly, the law of nature predicts successfully that in all other cases or events in terms of, the law of nature that we have, it continues and has always predicted in every other case successfully the either occurrence or non-occurrence of those events under those circumstances. So those are the 5 conditions to know that, yeah, this violates the law of nature. And we should go with a conclusion C, a supernatural God explanation that accounts for this. And yeah, he gives the example of the levitation of a certain holy man on page 310 and goes through how that example fulfills all 5 of these conditions, or at least could, in principle, fulfill all 5 of these conditions. Okay, so now Swinburne addresses the second part. Well, how do we attribute this violation of the laws of nature, this supernatural event, to divine agency, to God? And this deals with, this is Swinburne's attempt to deal with the second part or second stage of Hume's argument. So Swinburne distinguishes 2 cases. So in the first case, he makes it really hard for himself and he says, look, let's pretend there's no evidence for God's existence at all. Okay, well then how would we determine that God did this? Well, in this case, God is relevantly analogous to human beings in certain ways, right? And if you can prove that and establish that he is relevantly analogous to a human being in these circumstances and the occurrence of an event under investigation that violates the laws of nature, then that's good enough to suppose that God did it. So he gives an example. So suppose that the event occurs in ways and circumstances that are strongly analogous to human agents. And he gives an example in his paper on page 312 of a Sikh praying, please, God, I want there to be an explosion in Richard Swinburne's thing. Kill that guy. He is a bad boy. Kill him. Let there be an explosion in his office. And then subsequent to that prayer, he receives immediate voice confirmation saying, yes, I'm God, I'm going to do that. And then subsequent to that, an explosion happens in Richard Swinburne's office. Bada boom, bada bing. You would be an absolute fool if you didn't attribute that event to God. Because number one, the context mattered. This is a context charged with religious significance. That Sikh is praying to God for a specific event. He gets voice confirmation and identity confirmation verbally of that God would do this, and then that event happens, an explosion out of nowhere, violating the laws of nature, killing Richard Swinburne for being a bad boy. Yeah, you would be a fool if you didn't believe that God did that in those circumstances. That religious context provides what Dembski would call that specification, I think. And then he provides a slightly better case. Well, let's say that there is at least some evidence for God's existence outside of this. Richard, it's important to note that Richard Swinburne, he isn't even saying that it's equally probable that God exists or that it's more probable than not that God exists. That's so much better. He's just saying, even if there's just some evidence, 10% convinced that God exists, bada boom, bada bing, you're destroyed, skeptic. That's so Swinburne would say, well, look, in this case, the event would definitely be the sort of thing that we would expect and predict from God when we have at least some evidence suggesting he exists, regardless of whether or not the event occurs in ways analogous to human agents. So we don't need to make that argument from analogy. Just having some evidence that God exists alone would allow us to conclude this if we have an event that violates the laws of nature. He gives the example of the healing of the faithful blind Christian on page 313 of the paper, posted again on my Real Seekers blog for you guys to read. He says, yeah, in both of these cases, testimonial evidence is sufficient to overwhelm and undo any and all experiential evidence that the laws of nature are inviolable, and can't be violated. Rubbish. You got an event like this, you dang well can. So take that, Hume. So that's it. So this is getting into my assessment here. So I'm going to take a break at this point. That's it for Richard Swinburne. And then I'm going to take a bit of a break, and then I'm going to get into evaluating the testimonial evidence and generally, and testimonial evidence for miracles, as well as Hume's assessment of the actual evidence that we have. And I'm going to take that up and give my take. This is going to be new material. So yeah, look forward to that. And let me just stop the recording for now. All right, so hello. I'm going to be editing these parts together so I don't have to do the introduction. But yeah, so what I did last time, I finished off the main lecture on David Hume's take on miracles, and in particular, can we depend on testimony about miracles and come to rational belief on that front? Then we looked at Richard Swinburne's response. So David Hume had a two-phase argument. Number one, he had an in-principle argument composed of two premises where he said, look, the experiential evidence that we have just a priori overwhelms and just destroys any rationality of depending upon testimonial evidence to believe in a miracle and that sort of thing. Now, Richard Swinburne responded to that aspect by saying, well, no, actually, there are certain conditions, certain non-repeatable events that happen when they fulfill 5 conditions. That proves that they're not either naturally explainable or that we shouldn't revise the laws of nature as we have them. And therefore, we can conclude this is a non-repeatable event. It's supernatural. And then further, we can address the second half of David Hume's argument by rationally concluding that God did this event if there's that certain factors present, religious context and that sort of thing. So yeah, with that said, I want to move on now to my kind of assessment rather than Richard Swinburne's. And the first thing to do in looking at David Hume, so obviously his argument is looking specifically at the testimonial evidence and the value or weight that testimonial evidence has for us to believe rationally in miracle claims or something like that. So obviously, I want to look at, okay, well, what does modern philosophers say about testimony? Because in epistemology, I was lucky enough to take a grad seminar in my master's with Dr. Liz Jackson, one of the world's experts in epistemology. And one of the papers that I loved that she gave us, my favorites to read, was the Epistemology of Testimony. We had a couple of scholarly papers, one by Dr. Jennifer Lackey and another by Dr. John Greco. Both of those papers for free on my blog, realseekerministries.wordpress.com. So go and read them for yourself. They're great papers, philosophical papers. And they talk about the modern epistemology of testimony. When we can trust epistemology, testimony, how does testimony convey knowledge and that sort of thing? And, and all of that good stuff there. So I want to kind of just very briefly go over some of that now, just to kind of understand how testimony works in general. And then I'll turn my focus to my assessment of David Hume's arguments in terms of testimonial evidence for miracles in particular and what I make of that. So let's first talk about the epistemology of testimony. So this is a field that's relatively new in philosophy, right? So we have what's called classical or traditional epistemology. So, you have various, I'm an evidentialist, just like David Hume. Remember, David Hume, we are assuming evidentialism here rather than pragmatic encroachment theory or moral encroachment theory or something like that. So we're all evidentialists. Evidentialism is being assumed in this show. Great. So we follow the evidence and we proportion our beliefs according to the evidence. Great, grand, and groovy. Agree, Mr. Hume. But what's the value of testimonial evidence? And in epistemology of testimony, this is a field that's only been around since 1992. Before that, we had traditional epistemology where we looked at sources of evidence, such as memory, perceptions, our reasoning or inferences that we make. So these are the kind of traditional sources of evidence that we have, and it's all internal, it's all isolated, it's all, I do it myself. It's kind of autonomous, self-autonomous in a way. I reason out this thing, I see this thing, I remember eating this for breakfast or whatever it is, and therefore I gain knowledge, a warranted true belief or a justified true belief, whatever you think knowledge is, on that basis. It doesn't really involve others. Now, the epistemology of testimony is looking at testimonial evidence and says, well, what relationship does that have to knowledge? Is that a source of knowledge in itself? Does it generate knowledge in the same way if I see a red ball, that generates within me a warranted true belief, or what some people might call a justified true belief, and boom, I know there's a red ball in front of me because I'm perceiving red ballness, the qualia of redness and ballness right in front of me, right? So that generates knowledge. So yeah, let's take a quick look and go through some of this stuff in terms of, since 1992 is when the epistemology of testimony really kicked off as a field. 1994, some other authors kind of started summarizing it. Since then, there's been a flourishing of new research, thinking, critical thinking, and papers on testimonial evidence in particular. Two of the papers of which I mentioned to you guys, and we're going to kind of take up here. So let me share my screen here. Beautiful. Okay, slideshow. Okay, so evaluating testimonial evidence in general. So we have a key question here, right? So does testimony or testimonial evidence generate knowledge in the same way my perceptions do? Or does it merely transmit knowledge to the person, right? So philosophers have kind of realized there's a key difference here. So In the same way, my perceptions may generate knowledge. My memory is another evidential source, but memory doesn't generate knowledge. You have to already have that knowledge present through your perceptions or something like that, or inferences, or, you know, inferences does generate knowledge, logical reasoning, but memories doesn't really generate knowledge. It preserves knowledge. And philosophers of testimony here in epistemology have said, well, testimonial evidence is different. It doesn't generate knowledge. It's kind of more like memory. It does something different. It transmits knowledge from a speaker to a hearer, or, you know, from the original person to the hearer, speaker to the hearer. That's how they say it. I'll just keep it simple. So that's a fundamental distinctive aspect to how knowledge is conveyed here, and it's a social aspect. So that's quite different than the other sources of evidence that traditional epistemology looks at, right? Where it's all autonomous, and I reason out for myself, I engage in logical reasoning, I have my own memory, I remember this, okay, great, I got knowledge, and I'm perceiving a red ball, I'm hearing something, I don't need you peeps, the heck with you guys, I can do that all on my own and get knowledge by myself, thank you very much. But when it comes to testimonial evidence, this is a social thing. It requires two people, a speaker and a hearer, a conveyor of that knowledge to the conveyee, so to speak, the guy who receives that knowledge. So that's a fundamental difference with testimonial evidence. And that social dimension or aspect has a key role in terms of spelling out some of the major differences as to how knowledge can be transmitted testimonially. Okay, so yeah, so obviously here we have knowledge transmission. The only function of testimony is to transmit evidence. We don't have knowledge generation. Okay, and we have that example. I'll get into that a bit later. Another key question is, do you have to believe the testifier is reliable for testimony to have evidential weight? And I'm going to include in my blog a video, a quick 11-minute video by Dr. Liz Jackson, who gives a great summary of some of the three positions as she sees it, or I'll give them to you right here, but I'm getting this from Liz Jackson. She deserves the credit. So yeah, okay. Okay, so obviously we use testimonial evidence all the time in reality. You know, your mom tells you what's for supper tonight, or you rely on the testimony of scientists and scholarly consensus or medical experts. Your doctor tells you, hey, you've got cancer, you need to do this. You trust them, that testimony, and you form the belief, I've got cancer. Or how many times do we Google something and just trust that, rather mindlessly, I should say. So yeah, there are three fundamental views on testimony and how we should treat it. Okay, so the first view is just testimony skepticism. So you get a lot of fundy atheists and skeptics on the internet who foolishly go for this stupid option, easily refutable and falsifiable, in my opinion. But basically it says, look, you never get knowledge. Knowledge is never transferred or transmitted in terms of being from testimony alone. Nah, that's rubbish. Testimony doesn't do it. And believe it or not, is a Christian philosopher, John Locke, famous 17th century philosopher, who kind of is associated with founding this kind of view. Now, this is obviously false, right? And we have various thought experiments to prove that, no, I get knowledge. We all know, I know things from testimony. At least some things can be known through testimonial evidence. For example, I know when I was born, April 19th, 19 blank, I won't give it away. I'll let you guys guess. Yeah, how do I know that? I wasn't perceiving anything or in a cognizant way when I was a baby. No, I get it from my parents. My parents told me I have testimonial evidence. I have my birth certificate. That's more testimonial evidence from the government. And I trust this out. I don't think, oh, it's a big conspiracy and these guys are all trying to trick me and think, oh, I was born this date, but I was actually born April 18th. Those lying buggers. No, Obviously, I know when I was born based on this testimonial evidence alone. That's good enough. Testimonial skepticism, foolish, throw it in the garbage. But then here's where the real debate is in terms of the epistemology of testimony in modern philosophy. There's these positions called reductionism, sort of a middle view, versus anti-reductionism. And this is really where it's at. This is where the debate is. So reductionism, relating it back to our analysis of David Hume on the Testimony of Miracles, David Hume is the founder of the reductionist movement. His kind of take on how we treat testimony, he basically says, well, look, we get knowledge. Knowledge is transmitted testimonially, but only if we have good independent reasons, so non-testimony based reasons for thinking that the testifier is reliable. Okay, so that's how we know that testimony, if we have independent reasons from memory, from other sources of evidence, right? Memory, perceptions, or inductive reasoning is normally what's in view here, what David Hume had, right? That's how we know. We have to sort of independently fact check, and maybe we can inductively say, oh, you're okay, well, you're a reliable witness. You've told the truth a lot every time. I'm going to trust you. You're generally reliable. Therefore, if you give me testimony about this particular thing, I'm going to believe you. Remember in David Hume's thing, there are also two types of reductionists, which I'll get to in a bit. There's a global reductionism and a local reductionism. I think Hume would be more along the lines of global reductionism. Do you remember when he gave those three reasons to trust in general testimony? Let me see if I can go back to that. So right here, right? So you have the power of memory in general. So that's a global factor that you're trying to prove that testimony in general is generally reliable in general, right? People have the general tendency to tell the truth. Again, that's a global consideration. And then in general, people have this social class. They get embarrassment if they're caught lying. Again, that's a global reductionist consideration. So I think that's how he considers things. He would be a global reductionist, even though that distinction between global and local reductionism didn't exist in Hume's day, obviously. But David Hume was the founder through stuff that we analyzed of this reductionism understanding of testimonial evidence. Okay, so now there are obviously counter objections to this. I'll get more into details, but for example, children, right? Children don't have independent fact-checking sessions, right? They don't derive conclusions that, oh, you are generally reliable, or this testimony is reliable because of X, Y, and Z. Children don't do that. They just trust their parents and that sort of thing, right? They trust that their parents are generally reliable, and on their testimony, they believe all sorts of things. And surely we don't want to, Santa Claus would be a good counterexample here, but it would be stupid, foolish, and dumb to say that little children don't have any knowledge at all that's transmitted through testimony. Surely they do. My parents taught me when I was a little kiddie that, hey, you touch the hot stove burner, you're going to get burned. Well, that's knowledge. That's true, right? That's a warranted true belief that I had as a little 5-year-old kiddie. But I didn't independently check it. I didn't, you know what, I'm going to touch it and test you. Or, you know what, well, how many times have you told me something and it was true in the past versus false? Let me inductively assess that. Okay, you're generally, no kiddies doing that. Come on now, skeptics. Yeah, obviously that little children don't have to do that. And yet we all know that children gain knowledge. Knowledge is transmitted from the parents to the child, at the very least in some cases. That refutes the reductionist view. And there are also other examples from strangers, although that one gets a bit complicated, right? But I don't have any independent reasons to trust some random peep on the street when I ask him for directions, right? But we all do. We all trust that testimonial evidence, and 9 times out of 10, it's it results in knowledge being transmitted from that person, from the stranger to me, in terms of directions of how to get from where to there. So yeah, these are kind of the counter objections to reductionism and that sort of thing, just very generally here. Anti-reductionism is obviously, this is the view of Richard Swinburne, for example. He advances in his book the principle of testimony, right? Or the principle of credulity as well and stuff. But principle of testimony is the most relevant here. It says, look, testimonial evidence is good evidence without any need for good reasons, independent. We don't need any good non-testimonial reasons to believe that a person, to gain knowledge, to have that knowledge transmitted from a testifier to the testifiee, to me. No, by default, testimony is innocent until proven guilty. It's kind of like any other source of evidential source, right? With my perceptions, phenomenal conservatists or others would say, no, if I'm perceiving it, that's true, unless and until you have a defeater, an undefeated defeater, to make me think, no, that's not true. Same with memory. I trust it until it's defeated. Or my inferences, I trust that until it's defeated. Well, it's the same with testimonial evidence, according to anti-reductionists. And Jennifer Lackey is another example of this. Yeah, we trust testimony is innocent until proven guilty via an undefeated defeater being presented to us. So that's the anti-reductionist view. And I think that's the main view that most people go with on a practical level. But yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit more. I just wanted to outline the three views here. Okay. Anti-realism, why the heck does it say that? So that's supposed to be anti-reductionism. So just a quick objection that we'll get into in more detail. Anti-reductionism, obviously the reductionists like David Hume would say, innocent until proven guilty, you danged fool, you fool, you're so dang gullible, you idiot. You're gaining too much knowledge. Too much knowledge is you just trust anything and everything a person says. And again, there are certain examples. So for example, with that stranger, right? We trust human strangers for directions and stuff like that. Well, there might be an example. What about trusting an alien stranger, not a human? So we have no knowledge of what the species of people are like. Maybe they've in a society where they just lie all the time. We have no idea. You would be too gullible. If you just presume their testimony is innocent until proven guilty, you're an idiot. You're gullible. So that's kind of the main, from a bird's eye view, that's kind of an main objection to the anti-reductionist perspective. Okay, so basically in terms of evaluating whether or not to trust testimony, there are two basic factors that I think reductionists would want you to go and that are relevant, right? So number one, who said it? Are they generally reliable? Do they have a motivation to lie in this particular case? Are they in a position to know? And then also, what did they say? Is what they said plausible? Is it consistent with our background knowledge or not? How does it relate to our background knowledge? Is it a topic that this testifier would be in a position to know or not? Yeah, so stuff like that can represent defeaters for the anti-reductionist and that sort of thing, depending on what it is. Or from the reductionist things, evaluating these two things can provide positive reasons, either evaluating these on the basis of memory, perceptions, or inferences, logical reasoning, the other non-testimonial sources of evidence can provide positive reasons for believing that the testimony is probably reliable or generally reliable. Whereas on an anti-reductionist, these two factors would be more presented as, well, if you can prove that it's a defeater, right? The person who told you this is, the testifier is generally not reliable, and you know that. Okay, well, that's a defeater. So that's kind of the difference in perspective on these two factors here. Okay, so looking at Jennifer Lackey. So obviously, Jennifer Lackey wrote a paper in 2006. She kind of gets into the details as to, well, how is it that knowledge is transmitted from a speaker to a hearer, from a testifier to a testifyee. And hang on one second, I'll get into this in a little bit. I just got to take a break for a second. Okay. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to pick up from where I left off. Let me get back into the sharing the screen. All right, awesome. So looking at Jennifer Lackey here, again, she's done a lot of work and written a paper that'll be on my blog about how knowledge is transmitted from the testifier to the testifyee. And basically, she starts off by saying, look, it's obvious that testimonial evidence does transmit knowledge. A lot of our knowledge is testimonial in nature. She gives a bunch of examples. And she says that rejecting, if you take that testimonial skeptic position, the ignorant fool, like a Richard Dumboy Dawkins might take, then you're going to be stupid. Our lives would be ruined, impoverished. There would be startling, and quite frankly, it would be debilitating, impossible to live life, a normal life, if you just say that, no, you can't gain knowledge from testimonial evidence. A fool in the absolute biblical sense of the word, absolute lack of wisdom, lack of discernment, if you take that stupid view. Okay, so then she says, the two most important issues in epistemology of testimony is testimonial knowledge acquired only by being transmitted from the speaker to the hearer? I think that most philosophers, including Lackey, would say, yeah, it's a transmission. And then also this issue between reductionism versus anti-reductionism. Does the hearer have to have positive reasons before being justified in accepting the testimony as true? Okay, so testimonial-based knowledge must be formed through a hearer forming a given belief on the basis of the content of a speaker's testimony. So this is the first principle in the epistemology of testimony. So she gives an example here, right? So let's say I'm sitting around and some guy comes up to me and starts singing and says, I'm a good singer or something. And he sings, I'm a good singer. And I'm a horrible singer, as you can tell. So I won't do that to you guys again. But so on this basis, we form the belief, we gain knowledge, this guy's a good singer. But what is the basis of that? Is it the testimonial evidence? No, it's because, look, I perceived it through my hearing sense. I heard you sing, so I know you're a good singer. Through perception, that's really the source of the evidence, right? So that wouldn't count as testimonial-based knowledge. In order to be testimonial-based knowledge, it has to be the content, propositional content of the speaker's testimony itself. The proposition, I'm a good speaker. That alone, it forms the basis for the belief. That is what testimonial-based knowledge is. So that's a fundamental key principle here. In addition to that, we are able to derive knowledge inferentially. So kind of a combination duo, right? So we have background knowledge plus testimonial evidence. We combine the two to derive knowledge of some further thing. And Lackey gives the great example of, let's say you have a roommate and your background knowledge is that your roommate you gain testimonial evidence. Your roommate turns to you, looks in the fridge, turns to you and says, there's no milk in the fridge. And you also have this background knowledge, your roommate is a dang liar. Whenever they say there's no milk in the fridge, that means there is milk in the fridge. So you can combine these two things together and then derive knowledge that there's milk in the fridge type deal. So testimonial evidence can work in conjunction with other sources of evidence in deriving knowledge as well. Okay, so here's the main issue with transmission of epistemic properties. So this is known as TEP. By epistemic properties just means transmission of knowledge, right? That transmission of justification or transmission of warrant in terms of a warranted true belief, right? What is knowledge? It's a warranted true belief, in my view. or some people think knowledge is defined as a justified true belief, whatever that epistemic property is. We're talking about the transmission of that. And there are some theories about that, right? So obviously, according to TEP, the testimonial exchange involves a speaker's belief along with the epistemic properties it possesses being transmitted to the hearer, right? So a speaker, they believe that, or they have knowledge that the sky is blue. That contains certain epistemic properties. It's a justified true belief or a warranted true belief. And that's possessed by the speaker. And then they transmit by conveying their testimony to the hearer, both that belief, propositional content, and the epistemic properties, justification or warrant that's attached to that propositional belief. And there are two dimensions of the theory. So the first is the necessity thesis, right? So TEP-N. And this basically just says, look, for every speaker, A, for every testifier and hearer or testifyee, B, the testifyee, B's belief that P is known on the basis of A's testimony that P, only if A's belief that P is known. So in a nutshell, what is this saying? It's saying, look, in order for knowledge to be transmitted, these epistemic properties to be transmitted along with the belief through testimony or testimonial evidence, number one, the person conveying the knowledge or the testimony has to know that it's true. And secondly, I just got screwed up. Yeah, so the speaker has to know that it's true. That's a necessary condition in order for the hearer to gain knowledge and stuff like that. So I can't have a speaker that doesn't know that the sky is blue, and yet the hearer, he knows that the sky is blue. That's TEP says no. Knowledge on both parties is necessary. Secondly, there's the sufficiency thesis. So this just says for every speaker and hearer, if one, A's belief that P is known, two, B comes to believe P on the basis of that content of the testimony, right? So that's the principle that we talked about before. And finally, three, B, the hearer, has no undefeated defeaters for believing the proposition that was transmitted to you. In that case, then belief that P is likewise known by the hearer. So that's what the transmission or TEP theory says in terms of what's necessary and what's sufficient for the transmission of knowledge from the speaker to the hearer through testimony. Okay, so yeah, I've already said that. Now, there are certain objections to TEP, to this transmission of epistemic properties theory, or the transmission theory of knowledge through testimony. The first ones say that, well, look, actually, the transmission of epistemic properties is not necessary at all. The speaker, for example, they don't have to know or even believe the proposition that they're conveying or testifying to the hearer or the recipient. Even if I don't believe that the sky is blue or something, I've lost my marbles or something, I can still reliably testify to or convey that proposition to another person, and they can know that the sky is blue through my testimonial evidence. And they give an interesting example. That's a creationist example here. So Lackey's example is, let's say there's this creationist teacher, and it comes to science class and the topic of creation versus evolution comes up. And this particular creationist teacher doesn't know one way or the other. She knows that he knows that there's evidence on one side. He doesn't know what it is, but his reason for believing in creation is because he has blind faith that God is the creator. But he knows that there's some evidence that creationists point to. On the other hand, he knows evidence, credible evidence from evolutionists as well. So on this basis, they personally are agnostic. They don't believe that creationism is true. They certainly don't have knowledge that creationism is true and or that evolution is true, right? So for this example, Lackey's obviously a secular philosopher. So she's assuming that evolutionary theory as a whole is true and creationism or intelligent design is false. So we're just presuming that for the sake of argument here. So on this base, because of that, this creationist teacher teaches evolution as though it's true. She just says, look, human beings or Homo sapiens evolved from Homo erectus. She doesn't believe that nonsense. She doesn't definitely know that that nonsense is true. But even if that propositional belief, let's say for the sake of argument, it's true. And she testifies to that to her students, and then they as hearers pick that up, come to believe that that's true, evolution is true, and bada boom, bada bing, they've got knowledge, right? They've got a warranted true belief or a justified true belief that evolution is true for this sake of argument. Well, obviously, it doesn't matter whether the teacher knows or believes that evolution is true or not. Her testimonial evidence provided a proper basis for these students to know that evolution is true. So that's that example, page 434 to 435. Another reason we know that knowledge isn't on both sides isn't necessary here is that, look, speakers who have an undefeated defeater for believing a proposition in which they're testifying, but they can kind of manage to reliably convey the proposition through their testimony without transmitting the defeater in question to the hearers. So this is an example of the optometrist on page 434, case number 2. And Lackey's just saying, well, look, let's say this guy Bartholomew goes to his optometrist. His optometrist tells him, oh my goodness, your eyeballs suck. You cannot believe in anything. They tell you more than, some distance away. So on this basis, then Bartholomew leaves the optometrist, and he sees a car accident that happens to be further away than the minimum distance that the doctor told him he's not allowed to see. So he would be unjustified. He would be unwarranted in believing that there was a car accident there. He can't trust his eyes for nothing, according to this expert, right? So he wouldn't have knowledge as the speaker. But yet, let's pretend this Bartholomew character talks to Jennifer and tells her about the accident. But yet he doesn't tell her about what the optometrist said about his eyeballs sucking. She can still get knowledge. That knowledge can still be transmitted and through testimonial evidence, despite the fact that the speaker himself doesn't have knowledge. He's unjustified because he has a defeater, she doesn't. So the point here is that a undefeated defeater is not necessarily transferred or transmitted, is the word, transmission of epistemic properties, TEP theory. Undefeated defeaters are not necessarily transmitted from the speaker to the hearer in the same way that the knowledge is transmitted from the speaker to the hearer. So that's sort of an objection that some have come up with. There are also objections to the sufficiency thesis of the transmission theory as well. And there are examples on that front. Just to save time, I won't go over that, but read cases 3 and 4 on pages 436 to 437 of Lackey's paper. Okay, so what are the solutions to these TEP theory problems? Well, Jennifer Lackey says, well, the first bit is that we have to replace the necessary thesis with a reliability of the statement, right? So we've got to take the focus off of, well, is the speaker and the hearer reliable in terms of their gaining knowledge? That's going to lead to all these problems and counterexamples. Instead, it's the reliability or justified or warranted nature of the statement, the proposition being transmitted itself. So that's what's necessary to have the transmission of knowledge through testimony. Okay, so, and then there's the replacement sufficiency thesis, right? So this is what Lackey says. Number one, look, for every speaker, A and hearer B, B's belief that P is known on the basis of A's testimony, that P only if one, A's statement, not A themselves, we don't care about them, but if the statement that P is reliable, so the proposition is reliable, or otherwise truth conducive, that's condition one. Two, the hearer, B, comes to believe that P, again, on the basis of the content of a statement, so that's that first principle, it has to be based on the content of the testimony. And then finally, three, B has no undefeated defeaters for believing P. This, according to Lackey, this is sufficient for the transmission of knowledge from a testifier to a testifyee, from a speaker to a hearer. So that's her theory here. Now, some people have said, well, actually, there's a second solution. That isn't sufficient in and of itself. There may be additional criteria that are needed. And in order to solve that, this is where the debate between the reductionist versus anti-reductionist debate comes up. Depending on your answer to that, you may or may not require additional criteria beyond just the RS, the reliability of the statement, necessary and sufficiency theses. So let's kind of take a look at this reductionist versus anti-reductionist debate in a little bit more detail. So John Greco has written a great paper on it. And look, he asked, look, the main thing to ask here is, look, is testimonial knowledge able to be reduced to some other kind of knowledge, or is it knowledge sui generis, right? So the reductionist would say, like David Hume would say, no, testimonial knowledge is fully reducible to some other form of knowledge, inferential, inductive knowledge, reasoning, memory, perception, some other source of evidence really stands under and is the foundation of testimonial evidence. Testimonial evidence is not the basic belief. It's not this foundation. Anti-reductionists would say, no, testimonial evidence is the foundation. It provides us with knowledge sui generis, of a unique genre, unique kind in and of itself. And there are certain reasons why it's unique. Again, that social dimension or aspect to it in terms of the transmission of knowledge from one person to another. That doesn't apply to all the other forms or any of the other sources of evidence and knowledge. And John Greco says there's three main issues to work out. So number one, is testimonial knowledge distinctive? So that's that question again. Is it sui generis or not? Or is it just some species? So that's what we just said. Next, is testimonial knowledge reason dependent? So is it a basic, does it provide us with basic belief or basic knowledge? Or does it depend upon reasoning in addition to the testimony to be able to work, like what David Hume was saying with his things? Yes, you've got this testimonial evidence, but you've got to evaluate the testimony based on reason. You have to have reasons to think that the testimony is reliable. And then C, does testimonial knowledge involve default or immediate justification? Okay, so looking at the anti-reductionist or non-reductionist, it has its historical roots traced back to Thomas Reid, who was responding to Hume. And he just says, again, testimony is just this basic source of justification. In the same way, perception, memory, or logical reasoning and inferences are just justified, basic justifications and sources of that evidential justification. So they will say, look, so long as there's no relevant undefeated defeaters, hearers can just accept any and all assertions of speakers merely on the basis of the testimony alone. That alone is a valid source of justification, unless you have an undefeated defeater that takes that away. Now, there are two kinds of relevant defeaters for the anti-reductionist in terms of testimonial evidence. So the first are psychological defeaters. So this is basically a doubt or belief that's held where it indicates that that belief is either false or unreliably formed and or sustained. So you in your own psychology have this defeater in mind, and it tells to you that this belief is false or it's unreliably formed. You cannot trust or believe in the testimonial proposition being conveyed or transmitted to you. There are also normative defeaters, so that's just a doubt or belief whereby one ought not to believe the testimony. They should think it's false and or unreliable. Okay, reductionists, on the other hand, again, historically linked to David Hume, as I've said a million times. And this is where you need independent, non-testimonial positive reasons to believe the testimony is reliable. And here's where you get into the difference between global reductionists and local reductionists. So remember, I think Hume would be a global reductionist. These guys say, look, you only need to have positive reasons for thinking that testimony in general is reliable. And that's what Hume does, right? People in general don't lie because they'd be embarrassed if they got caught. People in general tend to tell the truth, and people in general have reliable memories. Now, the objection to the global reductionist, there are a couple of objections to that. So one is that it's too onerous to prove, right? Having to prove that all testimonies in general are reliable is too much. Why would you have to do that when all you really have to do is just prove that this particular local testimony is reliable? That's all you need to do. You don't need to prove that testimony in general. I don't care about the testimony about the age of the earth. That has nothing to do with whether your testimony is reliable in telling me that you're going to buy me a pizza tomorrow night. Finally, it's also not relevant or enlightening. Again, it's not relevant to the task at hand, right? We need to assess the reliability of the testimony for this particular belief that we're assessing, not in general. That's too blunt of an instrument. Okay, well, what about local reductionists, right? So this is saying that we need non-testimonially based positive reasons for accepting the particular report. Okay, that particular testimony is reliable. But again, even local reductionists, there are objections to this, and we already brought these up, right? So number one, children. They don't have any non-testimonially based positive reasons for accepting a particular report from their parents. They just automatically trust. And at least in some cases, we know for a fact they have knowledge. Knowledge has been transmitted. It may be not in all cases, like with Santa Claus, but at least in some cases. And this refutes the local reductionists. We also have the strangers example, whereby we trust random strangers to be cooperative with us and to tell us directions to a place. And if we got some cues, if their body language and stuff, if they seem confident and seem authoritative, they know what they're talking about. Yeah, it seems like knowledge is being transmitted from them to us testimonially. However, there is a counter objection in terms of the strangers thing. There's this alien counter example on page 442. And it kind of says, but hold your horses, right? This is the main objection, is that it could lead to too much gullibility and too much fake knowledge, right? Let's say we have that alien who comes down to Earth and he says, hey, we've got tigers on my planet and tigers are eating and killing us, and that's why I'm here to get some help. Well, you could do what reductionists do and say, well, what's the probability you would have tigers on an alien planet when they evolved, specifically on Earth and that sort of thing? Whatever, you can do stuff like that. But an anti-reductionist has to believe the testimony until they're presented with a defeater. So reductionists would say, well, that makes you too gullible, right? You don't know nothing about this alien. You don't know whether he's, you don't have a general tendency for aliens to tell the truth. Maybe their general tendency is to lie. and trick people. Maybe he's got a motivation. Maybe there's a psychological defeater where he's got a motivation to lie. He's trying to take over the planet and wants to trick you into thinking, hey, we as aliens need your help. Don't go against us and stuff like that. So there is that kind of counter example that reductionists raise against anti-reductionists. And obviously we saw with David Hume, he raises specific defeaters for deciding about the reliability of testimonies about miracles in particular. And he would probably say, yeah, that, you know, you're too gullible. The anti-reductionist would be too gullible in just accepting miracle testimony. All right. So yeah, that's it for now. Let me stop sharing my screen. So that's going to be it. No, it's not actually. So I'm going to continue my assessment. That's it for tonight for me. I'm going to take a break, but I'm going to continue on with my assessment now, focusing. That's my assessment of testimony in general. So my take, I would be an anti-reductionist when it comes to testimony. I do think that it clearly, at least in some provable cases, transmits knowledge from a testifier to a testifiee, from a speaker to a hearer, in other words. And I like Jennifer Lackey's statement, understanding of, you know, the statement has to be reliable. It's not necessarily about the speaker or the hearer having knowledge and stuff like that. No, it's the transmission of the reliable statement that's justified or warranted that allows for that transmission of knowledge from the speaker to the hearer. And I would take an anti-reductionist thing. I don't think we have any additional criteria. Let me just see if I can, one thing I forgot to do is the three things. Yeah, so reductionists would say, they tend to be, look, they would say that testimonial knowledge, it's non-distinctive. I would say it's distinctive. They would say it's reason dependent. I think it can be reason independent, as the case with children proves. And then finally C, not involving default justification. So yeah, I think there can be basic or default justification. I'm a little iffy on that though in all cases, because I feel the force of that alien counterexample, right? Just trusting strangers. But I think what an anti-reductionist would say is, look, in those cases, there are defeaters, undefeated defeaters to deal with those. And that's why we shouldn't believe those sorts of counterexamples, or, you know, in those cases, we shouldn't believe in the testimony that we get, and knowledge is not being transmitted from the speaker to the hearer in those cases. So that's how I would respond in general to that. So yeah, what I want to do for the next part of this show, let's turn into the particular case of miracles in specifically, and Hume's reasoning on that front. What are the flaws in his reasoning about the testimonial evidence, the nature of it, and also how we value it in relation to direct experiential evidence, you know, other forms of evidence. Yeah, so that's what I'll do when we come back to that tomorrow. So for now, I will stop the recording.